All right. We have another question. Actually, it's one, but it's broken down into three parts. And it is the defense of self-defense separate for each Is the defense of self-defense separate for each person in each count? For example, self-defense against person A, self-defense against person B, self-defense against person C, self-defense against person D. It goes on. Are we determining if deadly force is justified against each person in each count? For example, deadly force against person A, deadly force against person B, deadly force against person C, deadly force against person D. It goes further. Or, if we determine deadly force is justified against one person, is it justified against the others? So, my way of looking at it is, the question, first one is the defense of self-defense separate for each person in each count? And the answer to that is yes.
Yes, sir.
Are we determining if deadly force is justified against each person in each count? The answer is yes. And or if we determine deadly force is justified against one person, is it justified against the others? And the answer is no, not necessarily. Because we read the instruction that this is a situation where it's single defendant, multiple counts. And while there's one defendant, there are multiple counts, and each count has to be considered separately by the jurors. And so each element of each count, each defense to each count is considered separately as to the four individuals, obviously, that are the subject matter of the case.
Judge, would it be possible to reread the instruction where it says the defense of self-defense is for all 5 offenses, and he's charged with that very first paragraph? Maybe, and they have a copy of it, so maybe you can also tell them to refer to their jury instructions if your honor doesn't want to read it.
Well, Ms. Corey?
That doesn't explain it, Judge, because it applies to each count, not all counts collectively.
Right. I think that would be somewhat misleading. I can do it simply and just say, read the question. The first answer is yes. Second answer is yes. And the third answer is, in my mind, it would be no, not necessarily. They can apply it to all, but they have to consider it separately for all, for each.
I think that what you just said would be your answer, Judge.
You want to think about it, Ms. Corey, or talk to you?
Just read the third question again.
Yeah, the third question is, let me read them all again.
May I step up?
Yes, and I can do this a variety of ways. I can incorporate into my answer single defendant, multiple counts. Let me read that instruction. A separate crime is charged in each count of the indictment, and while they have been tried together, each crime and the evidence applicable to it must be considered separately, and a separate verdict returned as to each. A finding of guilty or not guilty as to one crime must not affect your verdict as to the other crimes charged.
Yes, sir. We would ask you to
So
do that first.
my thought would be, actually what I was going to do, and I'm open to suggestions obviously, is to answer these questions and finish my answers with that. But let me tell you the questions again. And I'm leaving out the part where they've written in, for example. We already got that. Is the defense of self-defense separate for each person in each count? I would say yes. Are we determining if deadly force is justified against each person in each count? Yes. Last question. Or, If we determine deadly force is justified against one person, is it justified against the others? And the answer is no, not necessarily. You need to consider each individual count separately. And then I would go into single defendant, multiple counts and read that instruction.
And if you're going to, again, if you're going with that instruction, I would just ask you to read the first paragraph and talking about it is a defense to all five offenses, as well as the use of deadly force. That's where the questions are from me. Because if you read that one instruction, it's almost, again, bolstering the state's evidence in a way and saying that. So just to keep it clarified, that first paragraph that says it's a defense to all five offenses charged, I would actually read that. And we're not going to ask them to then look back at the jury instructions and follow those jury instructions.
May we offer another suggestion, Your Honor?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you bring them out, read them the jury instruction itself, and ask them, does that answer your question? Because by reading that jury instruction, it should answer their questions as to considering each count separately.
Well, if there's conflict among you guys about reading the single defendant separate counts, I won't read it. I'm just going to answer these questions point blank.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, yes, and no, not necessarily. And let's make sure I say it the way, I repeat it the way I'm saying it.
And when you have your court read your first answer back, that's pretty accurate.
Well, the first one is simple. Is the defense of self-defense separate for each person in each count? Yes. Second one, are we determining if deadly force is justified against each person in each count? Yes. Third, or if we determine deadly force is justified against one person, is it justified against the others? No, not necessarily. Each individual has to be considered separately.
Each count, well, they're asking about individual.
So they're really only asking about counts 1 through 4. They're not asking about 5.
Judge, again, if
Because they're talking about each individual. Well, I guess they could be asking about 5. I don't really see that, but
Well, Judge, your first answer was just, no, not necessarily, and the state does not think that adequately answers the question, so.
well, that's what I was saying. I was going to say no, not necessarily, and then go on to say each
Judge, if you have.
each person
And Judge, whether both sides agree.
I think what I'll just say, no, not necessarily. Self-defense and justifiable use of deadly force must be considered separately for each person.
Judge, I'll have to go look at some case law, but I'm pretty sure you can reread the jury instruction that covers this very issue and answer those questions. I think you're entitled to explain jury instructions to this jury. Now, the question would be whether they all had to be reread, but I can't imagine why anyone would object to you rereading the instruction that clearly says, while these counts have been tried together, each one is to be considered separately, because that.
I don't think he's objecting to that. I think he says if I do that, he wants me to read the first paragraph of justifiable use of deadly force,
Yes, Your Honor.
which is an incomplete instruction, and I do not want to go through that whole justifiable use of deadly force instruction, because that is the most confusing thing, one of the most confusing things I read to them.
We agree, Judge, so.
And for the record, we must have spent, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours at least, collectively, I'm talking about myself and the attorneys, trying to reconcile the language that goes into that instruction, because as late as, well, on one of the instructions, which was the manslaughter instruction, as late as February the 6th, while we're in the middle of this trial, a Supreme Court decision came down changing the instruction, but saying, here are the proposed changes, but we're not saying whether or not even this instruction's a good instruction. And there were recent cases regarding this justifiable use of deadly force that caused a lot of concern and change and thought as to what the proper language would be.
There were also proposed amendments on the horizon that were published about that very same instruction, Judge, that just had not been passed yet.
Right.
So it was extremely difficult.
Judge, we think your answers should suffice, and of course, if they don't understand after that, I believe they'll let you know. They've been letting you know when.
I'll tell you, I said it last night. Of course, we're in completely uncharted waters. I'm not sure anybody's been involved with a jury that's been out as long as these folks have, but they are as hard a working group of people as I've ever seen. I mean, it probably goes without saying since they've been deliberating now for however many hours that they say, 22 or whatever. Well, so let me go back. We're good on the first two. Let me make sure I say what everybody can live with on the third. Or if we determine deadly force is justified against one person, is it justified against the others? No, not necessarily. And then I can go on and say self-defense and or justifiable use of deadly force should be considered separately for each individual. Because they're asking about the person.
And we have just a moment.
Yes.
Judge, if I may, again, your first answer.
Well, let's let them talk before, so.
Judge, our suggestion would be you don't need to say not necessarily. We think you should possibly just say no each, whatever your second sentence was. The not necessarily would imply ambiguity, and
Okay.
it's not ambiguous. It would have to be. And Judge may also supplement the record by saying that because there were 3 separate volleys of shots fired into multiple areas of the car, that this defendant admitted he knew had more than one person, this case is even more compelling that self-defense would have to apply to each individual
Right.
victim.
I mean, what I see is they could think that just justifiable use of deadly force or self-defense was somehow applicable to count 1. And if they really broke this down, I could see where they may think and believe that the last volley of shots, when by some testimony Mr. Dunn may have been out of the car and was shooting at the vehicle going away, that they may then say, well, the justifiable use of deadly force may have been in play to a point, and then it went away. Self-defense might have been in play to a point, and then it went away. There was no justification for that, those last set of shots. There was no self-defense there. And so they could very easily find some verdict on, for those 3 counts, because that would relate to the boys in the car that survived, and the shooting into the vehicle count. And then they'd be back to what do they think was the circumstances surrounding the initial volley of shots toward the rear of the car and the passenger side. Well, then let me back up. I can take out not necessarily and say, no, self-defense and justifiable use of deadly force applies separately to each person?
I'd say each and every count.
Okay.
And then, Judge, we've also put the caveat on there to refer back to the jury instructions as well. That way they can go back and read it for themselves and with that answer and then put those instructions in law in their place of deliberations.
All right, well, let me get the first language, and then we'll talk about that. So the answer is no, self-defense and justifiable use of deadly force applies separately to each count.
Yes, sir.
That's okay. And then your request is to do what?
So you can put in there that they can refer back to the jury instructions for any further definition or answer at that point. I don't want them to just rely on the honor to give an answer and then use it. They can still go back and rely on jury instructions and the law and instructions for their deliberations.
May I point out that they've obviously already done that, and they have a question
Right.
about it, and you're entitled to answer their questions.
All right, I hear that request from the defense. I'm denying that request. I'm going to just read it as simply as I've said it. Any objection from the state?
No, sir, not as stated.
Mr. Strolla, any objection other than what you've said?
No, I don't know what I said.
Mr. Dunn, raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Any objection to my answering question number 1 with this one-word answer, yes?
No, sir.
Any objection to my answering question number 2 with the one-word answer, yes?
No, sir.
You heard the answer to number 3, which would be no. Self-defense and justifiable use of deadly force applies separately to each count. Any objection to that part?
I do. I think this is very intertwined, and to say that they're separate is not correct. I mean, it wasn't, all three of this, all 4 of those people, it was intertwined into my defense of self.
Well, I understand that, but
I don't know how you would convey that.
well, you do understand that under the instructions that have been read, and one of them I alluded to a moment ago, because obviously there's only one defendant, but there are 5 separate counts, and each count has to, by law, be considered separately.
Yes,
It's not easy to compartmentalize these things, but technically speaking, that's what's supposed to happen. I don't know that jury,
One incident being broken down in 5 different ways.
right.
And that's what I mean by it's all.
And I recognize from your point of view, the whole matter was intertwined into one long incident. But the law requires that the jury look at it as to each count and look at it from your perspective as it relates to Jordan Davis. Look at it from the perspective of what happened with Leland Brunson and Tommy Storns and the other young man. So
Would it be possible to mention that even though they are separate, they are intrinsically intertwined?
We would
no,
absolutely.
you don't have to. You can't, because that's just not part of the instructions.
Okay.
But I hear where you're coming from. I'm just going to read it the way I've said it, because I think it's the simplest way. And these people are, they're good. They're struggling, obviously, but it's not for want of trying to reconcile all of this. So, and I think we've got some analytical people in there that are doing just that, trying to analyze this thing from every possible angle. So, all right. I think the record's clear. I'll bring them in and we'll answer these questions that way.
Jurors entering the courtroom.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. I know you've been working already. You can have a seat. I have your questions here, and so I'm ready to give you some answers. First question, is the defense of self-defense separate for each person in each count? The answer is yes. Second question, are we determining if deadly force is justified against each person in each count? The answer is yes. The third question, or if we determine deadly force is justified against one person, is it justified against the others? No. Self-defense and justifiable use of deadly force applies separately to each count. So there you go. I'll let you go back to the jury room to resume your deliberations. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time and attention again. From the state, please close that door all the way. From the state, any exceptions or objections to the answers as given,
No, Your Honor.
other than what's previously stated, Mr. Strolla?
Yes, Your Honor, no others.
And Mr. Dunn, other than what was previously stated, any other objections?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be in recess again until we hear from the jury. Thank you all for your attention.